Session number 206, looking at Zechariah 13, verse 7 through 14, verse 3. Title, The Father at Work. Well, the first three verses are going to back up in time, resuming the shepherd motif from chapter 11, if you remember it. Good shepherd, bad shepherd, and an act of Zechariah to carry out God's instructions. We're going to move back away from that day, the end days, to an earlier moment associated with the close of Christ's first advent. Namely, of course, it is his rejection, his crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. We're going to look at verses 7 and 9. They are poetic in nature, if you're into genre concerns. But remember, again, the two shepherd roles that Zechariah acted out. The good shepherd, which represents the future Messiah's work, his rejection, and Israel's scattering. The future bad shepherd, which foreshadows, of course, the coming Antichrist. Well, we come to the unexpected role of God next, God the Father, who's going to call forth an instrument of death. Which death? The death of the good shepherd. Look at verse 7. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who is close to me, or some translations, a man who stands by me, declares the Lord. And the sheep will be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones. That would be the scattered ones. The true shepherd, of course, who is also the true prophet, is the subject of an attack orchestrated by none other than God the Father. More than that, apparently God himself yields the sword that does the dirty work. Isaiah sort of agreed. In 53:10, Isaiah said, "Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him," that's Jesus, "and to cause him to suffer." And we see Peter, as I recall it was, in Acts 2:22, saying, "Men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you." How? By miracles, wonders, and signs which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by, get this, God's set purpose and foreknowledge. And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead. So that shifts the focus a bit from the last 5 verses of chapter 12, where Israel was said to be the cause of the Good Shepherd's death, or as we say, the causal agent. They were responsible for Christ's death. Look at verse 10. Zechariah 12, of course. "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced." You've heard that before, right? So when when the Good Shepherd was struck, the flock was scattered and a saved remnant arose. Christ made such a reference prior to his crucifixion when he said, and this is Matthew writing in 26:31, "Then Jesus told them, this very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. And of course that scattering began with the closest of Jesus' disciples. So that's where it was first seen, Matthew 26:56, just a few verses away. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him, Jesus, and fled. So the scattering is also believed to refer again to a later point in time, namely AD 70, at the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. That's when the Jews were really dispersed, disseminated throughout the world, and Israel ceased to become a functioning nation, in the true sense of the word, anyhow. Again, where it says the man close to me, when we were reading back in Zechariah, or as we said, it was also translated stands next to me. Well, the Hebrew really means that this man is a near relative or a very close neighbor. I believe Yahweh was clearly identifying the nature of his good shepherd with his own nature. In other words, the good shepherd is true deity. He is the true shepherd. John 10:30, Jesus said, I and the Father are one, meaning of one essence, divinity. And in John 14:9, Jesus answered to his own disciples who were questioning him in the upper room, don't you know me, Philip, even after I've been moving among you such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. So Jesus claimed this oneness of essence, just as Zechariah was predicting here. So never forget, God the Father ordained and directed the death of the Messiah, his own Son. But the last part of verse 7 also speaks of God's orchestrating the dispersion and purging of Israel as well. And look at the cost of purging Israel in preparation for the millennial kingdom. Remember, this is all end times stuff. We're looking at a judgment of major proportion to prepare Israel for entrance into the millennial kingdom. Zechariah 13, verse 8. In the whole land, declares the Lord, remember this, 2/3 will be struck down and perish, yet 1/3 will be left in it. So what does the purge cost Israel? 2/3 of its inhabitants. This is a time of cleansing and purging. 2/3 of the people of Israel, gone. 1/3 will enter the millennial kingdom. The survivors are evidently those who were mentioned in verse 10 of chapter 12 that we opened with here. The 2/3 were evidently removed during the tribulation or the judgment after Christ's return. And we'll talk about that a little bit further down the road. In any event, Israel's going to be purged, and even the 1/3 in the remnant will undergo purification by God. Look at what Zechariah says in verse 9. This third, that's the remnant, the survivors, I will bring into where? The fire. I will refine them like silver and test them like gold. Now, watch this chiasm. If you remember, those of you who've been with us for a while, They will call on my name. I will answer them. I will say they are my people, and they will say the Lord is our God. Did you catch that? They, they. They in, they out. That's not a good way to say it, but it is a chiastic structure where we have discussed that before. Remember again, notice what is it said? These are my people, that's what God says, but they will say the Lord is our God. The phrase my people, remember in Hebrew, Ami, a son of Hosea, where God's going to renew his declaration that Israel is his elect chosen people. Remember in Hosea, the term was Lo Ami. God is saying, you're not my people right now. Now he's saying, you are my people in the end times. And so the remnant of Israel will declare Yahweh to be their God. Well, what was happening? Well, Zechariah was discussing the goal of all of history. And what was the goal of history since the crucifixion and ascension? Jesus' appearance, having trouble with words again today, and his eternal reign. So what's up next? Well, a turning point. Remember, first God's people suffered, then God's enemies suffer. So God's going to purge Israel. After that, he will clean up on their enemies. Man's day is now. This is the day of the Gentile, and it continues, but the Lord's day is coming. The day when he sets things right is on the way. Let's move to Zechariah 14, the first couple of verses. Let me read those for you. A day of the Lord is coming when and that's Jerusalem, when your plunder, that means Jerusalem will be plundered, when your plunder will be divided among you. So those who plunder you are going to sit down in the middle of you and divvy up the spoils. I will gather all of the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. So, why is this siege of Jerusalem going to take place? God's ordered it. The city will be captured. Listen to this. The city will be captured, the houses ransacked, and the women raped. Half of the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be taken from the city. So even while Israel is sacked, right in the middle of the sacking, and the sacking was at God's bidding, he's nevertheless still in complete control. A major point to keep in mind as we continue in Zechariah, God is sovereign. He is always in control. Israel will be defeated in the battle for Jerusalem. The Gentile nations that are going to do the task, they're going to be under God's command. They're doing his bidding is how I guess I really want to say it. And though once they get the victory over Jerusalem, the siege works, they're going to feel so secure that they'll just simply sit down, split the spoils, right in the midst of and within the eyesight of the Jews they have conquered. A further embarrassment, I would think. It would make you really mad, unhappy, but powerless to do anything about it. Amos had earlier claimed that the day of the Lord wasn't going to be a great day for everyone. In Amos 5, starting in verse 18. Woe to you who long for the day of the Lord. He's talking to the northern kingdom now, and particularly the rich of the northern kingdom. Why do you long for the day of the Lord? That day will be darkness, not light. He's speaking, it's going to be darkness for you. It'll be as though a man, and here's his description of what it'll be like on that day. It'll be as though a man fled from a lion only to meet a bear, as though he's entered his house, put his hand on the wall, only to have a snake bite him. So he goes from lion to bear to house to snake. And it says in verse 20, then will not the day of the Lord be darkness, not light, pitch dark, without a ray of brightness? And that's true for those who are going to come under the gun on that day. Peter agreed, 2 Peter 3:10, Peter said, but the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar, the elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything in it will be laid bare. And even Zephaniah. How many times have you read the book of Zephaniah? It's a great little 3-chapter book, by the way. Zephaniah 1, verses 14 to 18. The great day of the Lord is near and coming quickly. Listen, the cry on the day of the Lord will be bitter, the shouting of the warrior there. That day will be a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of trouble and ruin, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness, a day of trumpet and battle cry against the fortified cities and against the corner towers. I will bring distress. This is God speaking now. I will bring distress on the people, and they will walk like blind men because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood will be poured out like dust, and their entrails like filth. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them. The psalmist said much the same thing. On the day of the Lord's wrath, in the fire of his jealousy, the whole world will be consumed, for he will make a sudden end of all who live on the earth. Whew. Note that only half of the residents of Jerusalem, however, are exiled. Half are left in place. When Babylon did the exile, of course, they took most of the people out of Jerusalem. They left a few, the poor, the helpless, but they did not leave many. So the end times defeat is going to fulfill all the curses from Genesis, from Deuteronomy 28:30. Curses promised for what? For covenant disobedience. That's why Israel's being chastised. The defeat of Jerusalem will complete the purging of Israel, and it will apparently lead to Armageddon, which we'll look at soon. At least we're told the defeat will come. Then God will empower the Israelites and the tables will be turned. Let me ask you a question. Could it be that God's purpose, or at least one of his purposes, in gathering the armies of the world against Jerusalem, do you think he might have done that so that he could defeat them all at one time, as he predicted? Two things. One, it will show his might and his power. Secondly, it'll show his knowledge, foreknowledge of events, and his ability to do as he said he would do. Look at Obadiah 15. Again, another one of these short books. Obadiah is a single chapter book. But in verse 15 it says, the day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. What goes around comes around. Your deeds will return upon your own head. He was speaking particularly, as I recall, about Edom at that case, but there's more than Edom involved. Isaiah 34 verse 2. The Lord is angry with all nations. His wrath is upon all their armies. He will totally destroy them. He will give them over to slaughter. The Lord is angry with all nations. His wrath is upon all their armies. He will totally destroy them. He will give them over to slaughter. Do you think there's any question about what God's claiming? He's going to be victorious over this bunch that attracts and decimates Jerusalem? I don't think there's a bit of doubt about it. Well, if as most believe, Jerusalem has to be trampled by the Gentiles in the very last days, which is what that siege would look like. The rebirth of the nation of Israel in 1948, some people said that marked the end of the times of the Gentiles. Well, not if the Gentiles are still going to come against Israel, against Jerusalem, siege it, and destroy it, take it as conquest. That doesn't imply to me that the times of the Gentiles are over. So the return in 1948 doesn't seem to be directly connected with the end times prophecy. Neither would it seem that Titus' destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, Titus is the Roman leader, that was a fulfillment of that prophecy either. Since two reasons for believing that that's not what we're reading about here. Some scholars think that we just read about AD 70, but Titus did not have the nations with him. He was only in charge of the Roman troops. Nor did his banner refine Israel as it is supposed to have happened. So, do all those things bring about dispersion? Yes. Did they bring about purging? Evidently not yet. Israel is a secular state. So Israel has not been purged as described in Zechariah. But just as it'll appear, though, that Israel, and particularly those in Jerusalem, will think all hope is gone. We've just been taken over. They're sitting down. They're taking our plunder. Our women have been raped, and they're just sitting there dividing the spoils. That doesn't look good for us. That's probably the end. But at that time, Yahweh steps in, takes charge, and comes not as an infant, not as a savior. He comes in as a warrior king. The deliverer of Jerusalem, yes, but a warrior king nonetheless. Let's look at Zechariah 14:3. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. There you have the warrior king. He's going to go out and fight. He'll also give supernatural enablement to the armies of Israel. Will go out, pictures a king leading his army, of course. In this case, the king to be leading the army is evidently the returned Messiah, Jesus the Christ. The Messiah will come as a warrior. He will come as a judge. No more little cute infant. So, some takeaways for this part. Every part of Jesus' life, death, burial, and resurrection was orchestrated by God the Father. Israel's chastisement has been, and always will be orchestrated by God the Father. But Israel's resurrection before the millennial kingdom will also be orchestrated by God the Father and secured by God the Son. the human and national cycle? Very simple. 4 steps: sin, chastisement, repentance, reconciliation, and restoration. Next session, we're going to examine the warrior king in action. Think Armageddon.